Israel Adesanya suffered his fourth consecutive loss on Saturday, March 28, 2026 at UFC Fight Night 271 in Seattle, stopped by Joe Pyfer, ranked 14th in the middleweight division. And the combination of that ranking gap and that finish is what separates this loss from the three that came before it. The three previous losses came against Sean Strickland, who was ranked 5th, Dricus du Plessis, who was the middleweight champion, and Nasruddin Imavov, who was ranked 5th. Legitimate, elite opposition. The kind of losses you can absorb into a narrative about fighting the best without necessarily triggering the career conversation. Pyfer was ranked 14th. Adesanya was ranked 4th, and the lower-ranked fighter won by TKO, which is the specific combination that makes this loss qualitatively different, regardless of how the fight itself unfolded in the opening 4 minutes when Adesanya looked sharp and was winning the first round. He looked good early, establishing range with a steady jab, punishing leg kicks, shutting down Pyfer's clinch and takedown attempts. The kind of opening round that would have you saying he was about to snap the losing streak if you walked in halfway through without knowing the context. The second round changed everything. Pyfer closed the distance more effectively, landed a crushing left hook that forced Adesanya into defensive mode, got a body lock, dragged the former champion to the mat, took the back, moved to mount, and unleashed the ground and pound that brought Herb Dean in to wave it off with 42 seconds still remaining in the round. That is 4 consecutive losses dating back to September 2023, 3 of the 4 by finish, and the last win being the Pereira knockout at UFC 287 in April 2023. The version of Adesanya that knocked out Pereira in the second round along the fence, calculated and patient and lethal, is the version he believes he still is, and the last 3 consecutive stoppages say something different.
Daniel Cormier asked the retirement question in the post-fight Octagon interview, and Adesanya's answer was exactly what he has said after every loss in this streak. "You keep going again and again and again and again. I'm not leaving. You'll never stop me. I might get beat, but I'll always remain undefeated." He said the same thing after the du Plessis submission in August 2024, that he was not going anywhere, that the losses outside the cage had prepared him for the losses inside it, that he walks down the street and they still call him champ. And now he is at 4 consecutive losses, and the message has not changed by a single word. From Adesanya's perspective, the losses are not the end of the story and never have been. He does not see them the way the internet sees them. He has said as much in every available forum, and his framing of this losing streak as something he can overcome rather than something that defines his endpoint is entirely consistent with who he has always been as a public figure. The question of whether it is even his decision to make is the one that the internet's version of this story skips past. The UFC is a business. Dana White runs that business, and fighters get released all the time for records with far less damage than what Adesanya is carrying at 36 years old with 4 consecutive losses and 3 consecutive stoppages. But here is the actual reality that the title of this video obscures. Dana White watched Adesanya lose his 4th fight in a row and said the man looked good. He has not released Adesanya from the UFC roster. Adesanya is still under contract and still planning to fight again, and the UFC appears willing to let him continue, at least for one more appearance. The fired headline is not what happened. What happened is that one of the greatest middleweights in the history of the sport lost for the 4th consecutive time to a fighter ranked 10th below him, said he is not leaving, and is waiting to find out who his next opponent will be.
Joe Pyfer's post-fight comments reframed the entire evening in a way that the scorecards alone cannot. Pyfer called Adesanya the best middleweight of all time, the highest fight IQ champion he has ever seen, and made clear that the man he finished is not someone he considers washed or diminished. That respect from the fighter who just stopped him matters because it separates the assessment of what Adesanya is from the assessment of what he was. Pyfer is not pretending he beat an easy opponent or a shadow of a former champion. He is saying he beat the greatest middleweight ever at a moment when that person could not sustain his quality across a full fight.
Pfeiffer also revealed the strategic intelligence behind the finish. He intentionally sold the calf kick as if it had hurt him worse than it did, manufactured the signal that Adesanya had smelled blood in the water, and used that look to draw Adesanya into the exchange that gave Pfeiffer the opening he needed. The student using the teacher's lesson against him. Adesanya built a career on traps, on reading opponents' aggression and using it against them, on the octagon IQ that made him seem several moves ahead of everyone he fought, and Pfeiffer studied that and deployed it back at him with devastating effectiveness. Pfeiffer's post-fight disclosure about almost taking his own life a few weeks before the fight adds a dimension to the evening that pure competitive analysis cannot contain. This was not just a ranked middleweight getting a career-defining win. It was a man who found himself at the edge of the darkest possible moment, and then walked into the Climate Pledge Arena and became the person who handed Adesanya loss number 4. The respect Pfeiffer showed throughout the build-up and after the fight, the strategic intelligence he brought to the game plan, and the personal weight he was carrying into the cage, all of that is the complete portrait of a fight that Adesanya lost not to someone unworthy of the outcome, but to someone who was ready to take everything he was given.
The trajectory of the 4 losses tells a story about more than just results. Strickland by decision, Duplessis by submission, Imavov by knockout, Pfeiffer by TKO. 4 different opponents, 4 different methods of defeat, 3 consecutive finishes. And the common thread is that Adesanya was not competitive at the end of any of those fights. He was overwhelmed each time, and the word overwhelmed matters when you are talking about a fighter whose entire competitive identity was built on being impossible to overwhelm. The last Stylebender's game was about range management, timing, unpredictability, and the psychological dimension of making opponents feel like they could never close the gap effectively. 3 consecutive stoppages at 36 years old raises the durability conversation that every analyst in the sport is obligated to have regardless of the discomfort it creates. The specific physical question of whether the body can still perform at the level the mind believes it can is the hardest question to answer from the outside, and the hardest one for the fighter to answer honestly from the inside. But the possibility that this is not about physical decline is also real and worth examining. Matchmaking and game planning and motivation are the variables that don't show up in the stoppage record, but that have historically determined when veteran elite fighters resurge versus when they continue to decline. Adesanya has talked openly about how meaningful it still is to walk down the street and be called champ, has talked about losses outside the cage preparing him for losses inside it, has framed every setback in his life, including the losses in this current streak, as something he can return from. And the competitive history suggests he has been right about himself before when the outside consensus was that he was wrong. The Pereira revenge knockout at UFC 287, the calculated trap along the fence in the second round, the patient execution of a game plan that ended one of the most personal rivalries of his career. That fight happened after a significant emotional and professional setback and produced one of the best moments of his career, which is the reference point Adesanya is drawing on when he says he will keep going. The middleweight division has moved on from Adesanya at the championship level in ways that the 4-loss streak makes structural rather than situational. Khamzat Chimaev and Sean Strickland contest the middleweight title at UFC 328 a few weeks after the Seattle card, and Adesanya is not in that conversation. He lost to Strickland, he lost to the man who beat Strickland, he lost to a fighter ranked 5th, and now he lost to the man ranked 14th. The trajectory is going one direction, and the division's championship picture is going in a completely different direction without reference to where Adesanya fits into it. The most likely scenario is that the UFC matches him against a lower-ranked or unranked opponent for his next fight, not as a punishment, not as a firing in slow motion, but as the specific booking strategy the promotion uses to figure out what to do with a significant name that is no longer winning at the level where it was positioned.
If he wins that fight, the narrative shifts from decline to resilience, from 4 straight losses to a fighter who hit bottom and bounced back, and the UFC can sell that story, because the UFC has always been able to sell Israel Adesanya to an audience that has a relationship with who he is as a competitor and as a personality. If he loses that fight, and especially if the finish trend continues, then the conversation is no longer about whether Adesanya should retire. The conversation becomes whether the UFC makes that decision for him by releasing him, not out of malice, but out of the practical reality that watching a former champion continue to get finished serves no one's interests, including his own legacy. The brand value of Israel Adesanya on the UFC roster is still real. He is not just a former champion, he is one of the faces of a generation of fighters, part of the wave of elite kickboxers who proved that the striking arts could translate to MMA at the highest level, and losing that from the roster would be a loss that goes beyond the win-loss column.
The version of Israel Adesanya that knocked out Robert Whittaker in front of 57,000 fans in Australia, that stopped Paulo Costa without breaking a sweat, that looked absolutely untouchable at 185 pounds during the peak years of his championship run, that version is gone. And the question is only whether a different but viable version exists. The physical changes that come with being a 36-year-old fighter who has competed at the elite level of the most physically demanding combat sport for years are real and do not require a medical degree to observe. The speed that was his greatest weapon, the reaction time that made his defensive footwork look like something no one could solve, these are qualities that diminish with time, regardless of training volume. But dismissing Adesanya solely on the basis of age and the losing streak ignores the specific complexity of what he brings to a fight that even Pfeiffer acknowledged immediately after finishing him. The fight IQ, the pattern recognition, the ability to set traps and execute game plans. These are skills that do not necessarily decline at the same rate as the physical attributes. The gap between the mind and the body is the specific tension that defines the late career phase of technically sophisticated fighters who were never primarily physical specimens. And that gap, in Adesanya's case, is the territory where the next chapter of his career will be determined. Every fight from here carries a weight the previous ones did not carry in the same way, not just because of the losing streak, but because of what the losing streak means for how the audience and the organization interpret each subsequent result in the absence of a win to interrupt the pattern. He has never been someone who backs down from a challenge, has never been someone who makes excuses or asks for sympathy, has said through 4 consecutive losses without changing his position that he will keep fighting, and the UFC, at least as of Dana White's post-fight comments, has not given any signal that they have reached the end of their willingness to let him try. The Dana White post-fight comments that said Adesanya looked good are the specific piece of information that tells you the most about where the UFC's institutional thinking is on this situation. Not fired, not released, not encouraged to retire, but assessed as a fighter who performed with quality even in a losing effort. That assessment reflects the reality of the fight's first round, which Adesanya won clearly, and the reality of the second round, which he lost decisively. And Dana White looking at both of those rounds and leading with the positive tells you the UFC sees something worth preserving before drawing a permanent conclusion. The 4-fight losing streak is real, the 3 consecutive finishes are real, the age is real, and so is the fact that Adesanya is still on the roster and still planning his next fight. And none of those things are inconsistent with each other if you understand how the UFC manages the late career phases of its most significant long-term assets. The question of whether Adesanya is being kept on the roster because Dana White genuinely believes he can return to winning, or because the UFC's ability to sell his next fight is still commercially valuable regardless of the competitive outcome, is the question that the post-fight comments do not answer. Both motivations can produce the same outcome, one more fight with a manageable opponent with a clear message that winning gets the conversation about his future more positive, and losing makes the retirement question answer itself without requiring anyone to make a difficult institutional decision about what happens to Israel Adesanya. What is on the horizon is a former champion trying to find himself again in a division that has moved past him at the top,
a fan base genuinely split between wanting him to continue because they believe in him and wanting him to walk away before the losses define how the legacy is remembered, and a man who has made his position unmistakably clear. He is not leaving, you will never stop him, he might get beat, but he will always remain undefeated.